why does Microsoft care so much about climate, and give us a few examples of what it's doing?
Yeah, sure. And I'd just say first, thank you all for putting this conference on. It's kind of incredible to be here in person with people.
I know, isn't it lovely?
It's fantastic. No, it's like, this is, I think since the pandemic, for me in person, it was nothing than COP than this. So
well, I love to be compared to COP.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully more comes out of this than came out of COP. But
Jesus.
No, but it's great to be here. So look, you know, we at Microsoft, you mentioned kind of there's a big company. We are a big company. We're a truly global, truly international company that's deeply embedded into kind of the socioeconomic fabric of the world. And so when we think about climate, and we think about our business, you know, there's this kind of almost corporate cliche phrase that we use that for Microsoft to do well, we need the world to do well. And you know, it's kind of hard to believe how much we believe that unless you're inside of the organization. But we truly do, because that's the scope and the scale at which we operate. And you know, you don't have to think very hard about it. You don't have to listen to many people to realize that the world is not going to do well. We've already heard from Dr. Hayhoe and others. We're a kind of a geeky company. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah, we have noticed that.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about Microsoft, but one that's true is we kind of are nerds. We're engineers, we're computer scientists, we love the math, we love the science. So for us, we just look at the math and the science of climate change. We look at the fundamental layer that climate sits in our socioeconomic systems. You know, I think Mark Twain, well, he didn't actually say it, but he stole a student saying it, which is, you know, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And the delta there is, that's what everything is built on. Everything in our world is built on the ability to understand that delta, to understand what the weather is going to be like within a certain time. Without that predictive ability, you cannot build enduring socioeconomic structures. You can't build infrastructure. You can't build societies. You can't build cultures. And so,
you mean weather as a metaphor, or literally weather per se?
No, weather.
Okay, all right.
Like, I mean, that's how the world works,
okay.
Right? That's what makes plants grow. That's what makes everything happen. That's what makes the world go round. That's how ecosystems are formed, and from ecosystems derive all of the socioeconomic.
As a computational ecologist, you're speaking. I just want to point that out.
Yes.
Go on.
Yeah. No. So for me, you know, it's just as that predictive ability decays, then that's where the terror comes from a climate perspective. That's what the world needs to fix so that we can continue having predictive ability about the future, so that we can build all these things. Microsoft wants to build a future for itself. It wants to build a future for the world. It wants to continue to empower every, you know, organization and person on the planet to achieve more. And so to be able to do that, we need our climate systems to be stable. And that's where it all comes from for us.
Okay, you've made some fairly impressive and unusual commitments. Talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe when we made them, they were unusual. I hope they're not impressive, because they're literally just what the world needs to do. We stepped back in 2020 and we asked ourselves if we were doing enough. And you know, we are a company that has been focusing on sustainability for quite a while. We were, back in 2012, we committed to being a carbon neutral company. We were one of the first large companies to do that, achieved primarily through kind of renewable energy and avoided emissions carbon offsets. We stepped back in 2020 and we said, are we doing enough? The 1.5 special report from the IPCC had just come out. It's really a wake-up call for the world. It wasn't a wake-up call for scientists, but for many people, it was the first time where they started to really panic. And we asked ourselves if we were doing enough. It's pretty easy in this space to ask yourself that question, immediately say, no, we're not doing enough. You can look around, you mentioned at the beginning, we're not on track to meet any of our targets. So we said, well, what should we do as a company? There's a lot of talk about what the world needs to do. And that's great, but it's part of the communication breakdown, I think, when it comes to climate. It's about what we collectively need to do, and then everybody looks at each other and is like, great, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? So for Microsoft, we asked ourselves that question, well, what should we do as a big company? And the answer that we came up with was to be a carbon negative company by 2030. And the way that we defined that was pretty simple. It was to reduce our emissions by half or more by 2030, and then to physically remove the rest from the atmosphere. And I know a lot of people will be talking about carbon removal. And so we're one of the first companies, we're definitely the biggest company out there purchasing carbon removal at scale.
You mean by like sequestration and that kind of thing?
Yeah, direct air capture, soil carbon sequestration, everything in between, all of the negative emissions technology.
And you spent a lot of money on that.
We're spending a lot of money on it, I think, and we'll probably get to that, but I think the number one thing that people need to do is to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to building the markets that need to happen. Ryan talked about OKRs. Which was a little bit, felt like a Microsoft planning session. We're definitely on the OKR bandwagon, which is fantastic, by the way, but I would say sometimes, by the end of a planning session, you kind of wish John had left like the OKR seedlings in his satchel, because you're like, man, I don't know if we can take any more. But yeah, I think it's about putting your money where your mouth is and actually going out and saying, hey, we're going to invest in this area. We're going to, for us, I look at how do you want to, mature a market, and let's talk about carbon removal markets really quickly, because that is a core part of our strategy. Extremely nascent, immature market, extremely. We went out, we put out an RFP for 1 million metric tons of carbon removal. Basically, what everybody had been talking about before was Stripe had put out an RFP to pay $1 million for carbon removal. And
well, good for them.
No, it was amazing.
They're a much smaller company, but yeah.
We were following in their footsteps.
Stripe was a real leader.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. And but then we came along and we said, we want 1 million metric tons. And that kind of blew the lid off the market, quite frankly. We bought 1.3 million metric tons of carbon removal in the first year. And that was really the vast majority of what the market had to offer. And so we said, this is a marketplace that needs to develop. There's 3 things that you can do. You'll learn this in Econ 101 if you want to mature a market. Well, I don't know if you will or not. I never took Econ 101, but presumably you'd learn it. You can be a customer, an investor, or a donor. Those are the 3 real ways to financially move a market. And we decided to be all 3. So largest carbon removal purchaser in the history of the world. We're one of the largest investors in the world. We have $1 billion climate innovation fund that we invest in this space. And we're one of the largest donors. We did a $100 million donation to the new Catalyst fund that Bill Gates, we heard about Bill Gates' green premium and how to avoid a climate disaster. So
I think that's impressive stuff, by the way, and because hardly any companies have even come close to that range of activities. So kudos.
Well, you got to do something.
Well, also, haven't you also kind of pledged to remediate every bit of carbon the company's ever emitted from its founding in 1975?
Well, so that's where the negative comes in. Because the question is about this term net zero. And how do we actually get to net zero? And the problem, and we'd talk about this a little bit, I break the world's problems down into meaning, measurement, and markets. And we've got to make progress in all 3 areas. But what do we mean by net zero? Well, when we talk about it, we say, well, the world needs to get to net zero, i.e. all of the anthropogenic emissions that go into the atmosphere must be taken out via anthropogenic means. But it doesn't say what you should do or what a company should do. And we're still having that societal conversation. So our carbon negative commitment was a contribution to that conversation to say that we're a company that has more. And right now is a time that those that have more need to do more. And so for us, we acknowledge the fact that there are locations, countries, institutions, individuals that won't be able to go as far, whether because of entrenched interests or disproportionate kind of discrimination that's happened over time or whatever. And so those that have more and can do more should do more. And so we said, we'll go back in time and we'll also remove all of the emissions that we're associated with since we were founded in 1975. And by the way, all of our commitments include what's called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. We talked about kind of your climate shadow, right? And when organizations think about their climate shadow, it's really about Scope 3, because Scope 1 emissions are your own direct emissions, Scope 2, the emissions associated with your electricity use, and then Scope 3 is quite literally everything else, all of your upstream supplier emissions, your downstream product use emissions. And so we included all of that to try to magnify our impact across the world. But we're still one company, so we're out there trying to make progress on all of this, but we need everybody to join in.
I hope more companies are inspired by you. Questions are very welcome, even now, if anybody has one or a comment. So, good. Okay, can we get the mic somewhere over here? Who? No, you won't, because we have an online audience of fairly good size, so.
Okay, check. All right. So, Lucas, thanks for coming. I'm Jamie.
Identify yourself.
Oh, yeah, I was trying to do that.
Sorry.
Jamie Beliveau from Intel Corporation. We work closely with these guys.
Microsoft.
Yes.
And one of the things that's been brought to my attention, in addition to everything you mentioned, thank you very much for continuing to be a corporate leader in this space, is some of the internal mechanisms that you've put in place to facilitate your behavior.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe for those, on the industry segment of things, if you could talk a bit about, say, the internal carbon fee, I think is one really good one.
Yeah.
That was on my list, so
might benefit from that.
Yeah, that's
sure.
really key.
Yeah, so let me just say really quickly, because I've touched on kind of 2 of the 3 M's that I talk about. The meaning, we need to come up with an actual definitional structure of what net zero means, not just for the world, but for every organization and every individual. The market side, we need to mature carbon reduction removal markets. And then that second M is actually around measurement. We need to do a much better job of figuring out how to measure carbon, particularly in our Scope 3 supply chains, particularly if the SEC's draft proposal goes through, where large corporations, large filers will have to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. Well, most of that measurement comes through spend-based accounting, right? Where we say, well, we know on average how much steel emits per dollar spent on it. And it's a rough and ready way to say, I bought X amount of steel, therefore my emissions must be Y. And that's fantastic. Those are the systems that got us here. But they're not going to be the systems that get us to where we need to go, because you can immediately think through the perverse kind of system that this sets up. We talked about Bill Gates' green premium. Well, if green solutions carry a green premium and you pay more for them, but the way that you measure the emissions is based on how much you spend on something, that means buying green solutions cause your emissions to go up, which just isn't going to work. This is a torturous way of getting to your question around a carbon fee, because you learn those things when you put yourself in the situation of having to experience them directly. And we did that by putting in place a real carbon fee. A lot of companies have what are called shadow fees. You put kind of a shadow price on carbon for planning. Microsoft has a real fee. It's one of the reasons nobody in Microsoft likes me, is
because you implement it.
Because I implement it. I go and take all their money. And then I buy things with it, important things like carbon removal. But it leads you to have to do that internal accounting and to figure out, well, this measurement system isn't going to work because I actually have to implement a tax that requires this all to work in the same way a tax might have to work, for instance, in a country or through a cross-border trade adjustment agreement. And what's clear is that the way we measure carbon, current accounting systems like greenhouse gas accounting protocol systems, which have been absolutely instrumental in getting us where we are today, they're going to have to evolve if we're going to be able to put in place some of these internal or more national level policy instruments.
Okay, that was good. Anybody else? Okay.
I aspire to achieve your level of dislike.
Okay, we're going to pass the mic right over here. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ron Erd, and I help companies bring these green technologies to market. I have sort of a 2-part related question. The first part is, what is Microsoft's strategy to remove all of the carbon? And then the second part is, with the investments you're making, how is that going to enable corporate America to get to net zero by 2050? Because it seems like most companies have that goal, but not a plan.
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think for corporate America to get there, most of those companies are going to need more than just a goal. They're going to need a plan. You know, at Microsoft, we talk a lot right now about from pledges to progress. We've basically, now people have made their pledges. You know, the Amazon led something called the Climate Pledge that Microsoft joined. I think that's a fantastic first step in people, you know, making a base level commitment. Then there's things like the Transform to Net Zero Coalition, which we're part of, which are putting kind of draft, you know, plans in place for companies to take forward. But I would say on the carbon removal bit, well, what we're doing is we're one of the few buyers out there working to purchase both immediate and long-term contractual obligations to take carbon removal as and when available and across the negative emissions technology spectrum. So things like direct air capture, afforestation, reforestation, enhanced mineralization, you name it, we're buying it. So that's a significant part. But I would say right now what we learned is, you know, the market can barely support Microsoft's demands.
There's just not enough supply.
There's just not enough supply.
Yeah.
And that's fine for right now, kind of, I guess. But it's not fine for 2030. It's not fine for 2050 because the rest of corporate America, and by the way, it's not just corporate America, it's corporate, needs to get into this game. And so that market needs to mature. But you know, that's why we're also investing $1 billion. That's why we donated $100 million. Like we're trying to put money and incentives into the system to get this stuff to go. But it can't just be us that's out there buying.
Okay, and we have to wrap, but you know, I assume that you believe that doing this is good for business because you want to grow, right?
Yeah.
So I know you have this whole, I mean, you're a big cloud company. Answer this fast, but how do you think about this, the marketing and commercial benefit of positioning your cloud as effectively the most sustainable cloud because of all the actions you're taking?
Well, two quick things. Everyone talks about needing to decouple growth from carbon emissions. Basically, the only real way anyone showed how to do that from an economic perspective is to digitize the analog world, right? Move that into electron consumptive kind of businesses and figure out ways to generate those electrons from renewable zero carbon sources. So that's kind of move to the cloud, digitize the analog, put it in the cloud, run things there. And then the second thing I would just say from a business perspective is, you mentioned in your intro remarks, every company is going to have 2 sets of books. I think that's partly.
I might have stolen that line from you, but go on.
Yeah, well, don't tell people that because CFOs don't like the idea of 2 sets of books. But the point is, that's a huge platform, technology platform opportunity. We've got folks in the audience that run companies that are in that space. Microsoft's in that space. Many other technology companies are in that space. I think there's massive.
You mean selling software that allows that to happen?
I think there's a huge software sector that's already starting to rise, that when you look back 20 years from now, and if you were an investor.
But we have another one of those
space,
coming on right after you.
Then you missed it.
Okay, good. Really.
Good, thank you.
So good.